I thought I knew what humiliation felt like until I walked into La Bernardine's private cooking class that Tuesday evening in October. My name is Sarah, and I'd saved for 6 months to afford this $200 experience. I was 34, recently divorced, working as a marketing coordinator at a small firm, and desperate to find something that belonged entirely to me. Cooking had always been my escape. My grandmother's recipes scribbled on index cards were my most treasured possessions, but I wanted to learn proper technique. I wanted to understand why my hollandaise sometimes broke, why my soufflé fell, why my knife skills looked like a toddler's artwork compared to the fluid motions I watched on cooking shows. So there I was, standing in this gleaming teaching kitchen with 15 other students, most of whom looked like they'd stepped out of a Williams-Sonoma catalog. Designer aprons, professional knife rolls, the kind of casual confidence that comes with disposable income and country club memberships. I wore my lucky thrift store blouse and carried my grandmother's ancient cast iron pan because the class description said we could bring one special tool from home. The moment Chef Marcus Beaumont laid eyes on me, I knew I'd made a mistake. He was tall, silver-haired, with the kind of accent that made everything sound either romantic or condescending, depending on his mood. His eyes swept over our little group, pausing briefly on each student's setup, lingering on their expensive equipment, their pressed chef's whites, their eager faces. When he reached me, standing there with my cast iron pan and my Target apron, his expression shifted into something I couldn't quite name at first. Later, I'd recognize it as the look predators give to prey they've already decided to toy with before the kill. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying that theatrical quality that celebrity chefs seem to develop, "tonight we will be preparing a classic French menu. Coq au vin, pomme Anna, and a chocolate soufflé. These are dishes that require precision, technique, and respect for tradition." His gaze found mine again. "Some of you may find this challenging. French cuisine is not forgiving to amateur enthusiasm." The first red flag should have been when he assigned stations. Everyone else got prime real estate near the demonstration area, close to the prep sinks, with easy access to the walk-in cooler. I got relegated to the corner station, next to the dishwasher, where the lighting was poor and the burner flames were uneven. "This should be adequate for your skill level," Chef Beaumont said, not quite under his breath. The other students pretended not to hear, but I caught the uncomfortable glances, the way conversations suddenly became very focused on chopping techniques and wine selections. I should have left then, should have demanded my money back, and walked out with whatever dignity I had left. But something in me, some stubborn part, that had survived my ex-husband's constant criticism about my cooking, that had endured years of being told I wasn't good enough at this, smart enough for that, pretty enough for the other thing, decided to stay. I unpacked my grandmother's cast iron pan and set it on the cramped burner. The demonstration began, and I have to admit, Chef Beaumont was skilled. His knife work was poetry, his sauces silk, his timing impeccable. He moved through the steps of breaking down a chicken with surgical precision, explaining the importance of preserving the integrity of each joint, the way proper technique could mean the difference between tender meat and tough disappointment. "The coq au vin," he said, "is a peasant dish elevated through technique, originally created to make use of old roosters too tough for roasting. But in the hands of a trained chef, it becomes something transcendent." He paused, his eyes finding mine across the kitchen. Of course, without proper understanding of the fundamentals, it remains exactly what it started as: peasant food. The insult was delivered with such casual elegance that half the class missed it entirely. But I heard it, felt it land like a physical blow. Around me, the other students began working on their mise en place, the careful preparation that precedes any serious cooking. I watched them arrange their ingredients with the kind of methodical precision that spoke of previous classes, private instruction, years of casual weekend workshops with friends who knew the difference between brunoise and julienne. I started slower, checking and double-checking the recipe card, measuring twice, because I knew I wouldn't get the benefit of the doubt if something went wrong. My hands were steady, muscle memory from countless Sunday dinners with my grandmother guiding my movements as I broke down my chicken. I could almost hear her voice. "Low and slow, sweetheart. Good food doesn't rush." 20 minutes in, Chef Beaumont began his rounds, critiquing and correcting as he moved from station to station. With Margaret, the real estate agent with the $700 knife set, he was all gentle encouragement. Beautiful technique. Very nice color on that sear. With David, the investment banker practicing for his girlfriend's birthday, he offered helpful suggestions. Perhaps a touch more wine in the braising liquid. Yes, that's perfect. When he reached my station, the temperature in my corner of the kitchen seemed to drop 10 degrees. He stood behind me, close enough that I could smell his cologne, expensive and cloying. I was browning my chicken pieces in the cast iron pan, the oil shimmering at exactly the right temperature, the skin crackling and golden. It was going well. Too well, apparently. Interesting choice of cookware, he said, loud enough for the nearby stations to hear. Cast iron. Very rustic. I suppose when you're working with peasant ingredients, peasant tools make a certain sense. I kept my focus on the pan, didn't rise to the bait. The chicken was browning beautifully, better than some of the pieces I could see at other stations, where expensive stainless steel pans were producing uneven results. The heat retention is excellent for this type of braising, I said quietly, flipping a thigh to reveal a perfect golden crust. My grandmother always said cast iron remembers every meal you cook in it. Chef Beaumont leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more threatening than his public commentary. Your grandmother wasn't cooking in a professional kitchen. This is Le Bernardin, not some backyard barbecue. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable in a community center class. The word stung, but something else was happening. The other students were starting to pay attention, not to his criticism, but to what was actually happening in my pan. My chicken looked better than theirs. My vegetables, diced with my grandmother's old paring knife, were more uniform than the expensive mandolin work happening at other stations. My sauce, building slowly in the fond left by the perfectly browned chicken, was developing a depth of color and complexity that made the demonstration version look pale by comparison. Sarah, is it? Chef Beaumont's voice carried across the kitchen now, drawing everyone's attention. Would you like to share with the class what you think you're doing differently from the technique I demonstrated? This was it. The moment he'd been building toward, the public humiliation that would validate his initial assessment and put me firmly in my place. I could feel the other students, eyes on me, some sympathetic, others curious, a few clearly relieved that they weren't in the spotlight. I looked down at my pan, at the work of my hands, at the meal that was coming together exactly the way my grandmother had taught me decades ago in her tiny kitchen with its ancient gas stove and mismatched pots. Then I looked up at Chef Beaumont, this man who'd decided before I'd even touched an ingredient that I didn't belong in his world. I'm not doing anything differently from your technique, I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. I'm just using better ingredients and equipment that's been properly seasoned by 40 years of good cooking. The kitchen went completely silent. Even the dishwasher stopped running. Chef Beaumont's face flushed red above his pristine white collar. Excuse me? My chicken came from a farm in upstate New York, where the birds actually move around and eat real food. It costs 3 times what you'd pay at the grocery store, but the flavor and texture are incomparable. My wine is a 2018 Burgundy that I brought from home because I read the class supply list and noticed you were planning to use 2 buck chuck for a dish that's supposed to showcase the wine. And this pan? I tapped the handle of my grandmother's cast iron. This pan has cooked thousands of meals. It's seasoned with layers of love and butter and thyme. It holds heat better than anything you have in this kitchen, and it's going to produce a better result than those beautiful, expensive, soulless pieces of metal everyone else is struggling with. You could have heard a pin drop. Margaret's knife had stopped moving entirely. David was staring at me like I'd just announced I was planning to burn the building down, but my coq au vin was still simmering, filling the air with an aroma that was making everyone's mouth water, including Chef Beaumont's, though he was trying very hard not to show it. Furthermore, I continued, because apparently I'd decided to commit fully to this moment of professional suicide, you've been teaching the browning process wrong. You're telling everyone to use high heat for quick searing, but that's creating uneven caramelization and spattering oil all over their stovetops. Medium-high heat, patience, and proper fat temperature will give you better color, better flavor, and better control. Which is what I've been doing while you've been making comments about peasant food. Chef Beaumont's jaw was working like he was chewing something particularly tough. His hands, I noticed, were trembling slightly. Not with fear, but with rage. Pure, undiluted rage at having his expertise questioned by someone he'd already dismissed as beneath notice. "I think," he said, his accent thickening with emotion, "you should pack up your equipment and leave my kitchen. This class is for serious students, not delusional amateurs who think they know better than trained professionals." "I paid $200 for this class," I said calmly. "I'm staying until the end. And then I'm going to eat my dinner, which is going to be better than anything anyone else in this room produces tonight, including your demonstration dish." The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a grease fire. Around us, the other students had completely abandoned their cooking to watch this showdown between the celebrity chef and the woman with the cast iron pan. I could see some of them starting to really look at what I was doing, comparing it to their own struggling attempts at the recipe. My vegetables were perfectly uniform, despite being cut with a knife that was older than most of them. My sauce was developing complex layers, while theirs remained thin and one-dimensional. My kitchen station, cramped and poorly lit as it was, smelled like everything delicious about French country cooking, while the rest of the room smelled like expensive ingredients being treated with expensive incompetence. Chef Beaumont stepped closer, his voice dropping to that dangerous whisper again. "You have no idea what you've just done. I could make one phone call and ensure you never get a reservation at any decent restaurant in this city again. I could post about this little tantrum on social media and make you a laughingstock. You think your grandmother's recipes and your yard sale cookware make you special? You're nothing. A nobody who got lucky with a few decent ingredients." I looked at him for a long moment. This man who'd built his reputation on intimidation and borrowed French techniques, who thought that cruelty was a sign of culinary sophistication. Then I smiled. Not a nice smile, not a polite smile, a smile that came from some deep place that had been storing up responses to every man who'd ever told me I wasn't good enough, smart enough, worthy enough to share the same space. "Chef Beaumont," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "you're absolutely right about one thing. I am nothing special. I'm just a marketing coordinator from Queens who learned to cook from her grandmother. But the difference between us is that I cook with love and you cook with ego. And everyone in this room can smell the difference." I turned back to my station and continued working on my coq au vin. Behind me, I could hear the whispered conversations starting up again, the careful scrape of knives on cutting boards, the tentative sizzle of ingredients hitting hot pans. But the energy in the room had shifted. The other students kept glancing over at my station, trying to figure out what I was doing that they weren't. Chef Beaumont retreated to his demonstration area, his movements sharp and angry, his commentary reduced to terse corrections delivered from a distance. For the next hour, I cooked my heart out, not to prove anything to him, not to show off for the other students, but because this was what I'd come here to do. To cook something beautiful and delicious, to honor my grandmother's memory, to create something that would nourish people and make them happy. The coq au vin simmered low and slow, the wine reducing to a glossy, complex sauce that coated the back of a spoon. The chicken fell apart at the touch of a fork, tender and flavorful from its long braise in burgundy and aromatics. My pommes Anna, layered thin and golden in a small cast-iron skillet I'd borrowed from the kitchen's collection, were crispy outside and creamy inside, each layer distinct but harmonious. The chocolate soufflé, which I'd been dreading as the most technically challenging part of the menu, rose like a small miracle in the oven, its top golden and proud, its interior molten perfection. When time was called, I plated my 3 dishes with the kind of careful attention I'd learned from watching my grandmother turn simple Sunday dinners into works of art. Nothing fancy, no architectural towers or dramatic drizzles, just good food presented with respect for its ingredients and honest pride in the craft. Then came the tasting. This was supposed to be the part where Chef Beaumont critiqued our work, offering professional insight into our successes and failures, providing the kind of expert feedback that justified the class fee. Instead, he moved through the room like a man walking to his execution, taking perfunctory bites, offering bland encouragement or gentle criticism depending on his mood and the student's ability to accept it gracefully. When he reached my station, he stood there for a long moment, looking at my 3 plates like they might bite him. The coq au vin gleamed in its pool of dark sauce, fragrant steam still rising from the tender meat. The pommes Anna were golden and perfect, each layer visible in the cross-section I'd cut to show the technique. The soufflé had fallen slightly in the cooling, but it was still magnificent, its center rich and molten when I tasted it moments before. "Go ahead," I said quietly. "Try it." He picked up a fork with the reluctance of a man being asked to taste poison, cut a piece of chicken, made sure it was well coated with sauce, and took a bite. I watched his face carefully, looking for the moment when his preconceptions collided with reality. It came quickly. His eyes widened slightly, then narrowed. He chewed slowly, thoughtfully, his expression cycling through surprise, recognition, and something that looked almost like pain. He swallowed, set down his fork, and looked at me with something I hadn't seen in his face all evening. Respect. Grudging, unwilling respect, but respect nonetheless. "The chicken is perfectly cooked," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "The sauce has excellent depth and balance. Your technique is sound." It wasn't an apology, but it was as close as a man like Chef Beaumont was capable of getting. Around us, the other students were finishing up their own tastings, comparing notes, discussing what they'd learned. But I could see them glancing over at my station, at the food that had somehow become the standard against which they were measuring their own work. "There's something else," I said, meeting his eyes directly. "I've been thinking about entering the James Beard Foundation's amateur chef competition next month. The theme is Heritage Recipes Reimagined. I think my grandmother's coq au vin might have a chance." Chef Beaumont went very still. The James Beard Foundation competition was serious business, judged by some of the most respected names in American cuisine. Winners got featured in Food and Wine, opportunities to work with established chefs, sometimes even cookbook deals. It was the kind of recognition that could change someone's life, that could transform a marketing coordinator with a passion for cooking into someone the culinary world took seriously. "That's a very competitive event," he said carefully. "The level of skill required is quite high. The judges are exacting in their standards." I smiled at him, the same dangerous smile from earlier, but warmer now, less angry and more determined. "I know. I've been researching it for months. Did you know that 3 of the 5 judges this year are women? And 2 of them specifically mentioned in interviews that they're looking for authenticity over flashy technique, for dishes that tell stories rather than just show off knife skills?" His face had gone pale. I could see him doing the math, understanding what I was really telling him. That his little performance tonight, his public humiliation of a paying student, might not stay contained in this kitchen. That if I did well in the competition, if I got any attention at all, the story of the celebrity chef who mocked a home cook might become part of my narrative. And in the current climate, where restaurant culture was finally being held accountable for decades of toxic behavior, that story wouldn't reflect well on him. "Sarah," he said, and my name sounded different in his mouth now, careful and considered. "I think perhaps we got off on the wrong foot tonight. You clearly have talent, and I may have been too quick to judge. If you're serious about the competition, I'd be happy to offer some guidance." I looked at him for a long moment, this man who'd spent the evening trying to crush my confidence, who was now offering mentorship because he was afraid of the consequences of his cruelty. Then I began packing up my grandmother's cast iron pan, wrapping it carefully in the towel I'd brought from home. "Thank you," I said politely, "but I think I'll stick with my current teacher. She may be gone, but she's still the best chef I know." I walked out of that kitchen with my head high, carrying my grandmother's pan and the knowledge that I could cook circles around a celebrity chef when it mattered. Behind me, I could hear the whispered conversations starting up again, but this time, they weren't about my inadequate equipment or my presumptuous attitude. They were about the woman who'd stood up to Marcus Beaumont and then backed up her words with the best meal anyone in that room had tasted all night. 3 weeks later, I submitted my entry to the James Beard Foundation competition. Not coq au vin, actually, but my grandmother's Sunday gravy, a recipe that had been in my family for 4 generations, elevated with some techniques I'd learned from books and practice and sheer determination. The dish that had always made me feel loved, that had brought our family together around the table every week of my childhood, that carried the weight of tradition and the promise of continuity. I didn't know if I'd win. I didn't even know if I'd place. But I knew that whatever happened, I'd be cooking with love instead of ego, with respect instead of arrogance, with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from understanding that the best food isn't about impressing people or asserting dominance. It's about nourishing them, connecting with them, sharing something essential about who you are and where you come from. The application asked for a brief description of the dish and its significance. I wrote about my grandmother, about Sunday dinners that lasted hours, about learning that cooking wasn't just about feeding people but about showing them they mattered. I wrote about cast iron pans and hand-me-down recipes, about the difference between technique and soul, about what it means to honor the past while creating something new. I didn't mention Chef Beaumont or the cooking class or the humiliation that had sparked this journey. That wasn't the story I wanted to tell, but I knew he'd be watching when the winners were announced, wondering if the woman with the cast iron pan had been serious about her threats, or if she'd just been another amateur with delusions of grandeur. 2 months later, I got the call. Not first place, but second in the Heritage Recipes category, which was enough to get me featured in Food & Wine's Rising Stars issue, enough to get offers from 3 different restaurants who wanted to collaborate on pop-up dinners, enough to prove that love and tradition and respect for ingredients could compete with any amount of formal training or professional pedigree. The article came out on a Tuesday, with a beautiful photo of me in my grandmother's kitchen, wearing her old apron, stirring Sunday gravy in the same cast iron pan that had caused such offense at Le Bernardin. The reporter had done her homework, interviewing not just me but several of the other students from that cooking class, who'd apparently been more affected by that evening than I'd realized. Margaret, the real estate agent, told the reporter that watching me stand up to Chef Beaumont had inspired her to finally leave her controlling marriage. David, the investment banker, had started taking more serious cooking classes and was considering a career change. 3 other students had specifically mentioned that night as a turning point in how they thought about cooking, about authenticity, about the difference between intimidation and instruction. But the most interesting quote came from an unnamed source who'd been present that evening, someone the reporter identified only as a kitchen staff member. The quote was simple but devastating. Chef Beaumont spent 20 minutes trying to humiliate a paying customer because she brought a cast iron pan to a French cooking class. Then she cooked the best coq au vin I've ever tasted, and he knew it. The whole kitchen knew it. She didn't just outcock him, she outcast him. The article didn't mention Chef Beaumont by name, but anyone familiar with the New York restaurant scene would know which celebrity chef ran French cooking classes at Le Bernardin, which instructor was known for his theatrical demonstrations and cutting commentary. The piece was titled, "From Cast Iron to Competition: How One Home Cook's Heritage Recipe Earned James Beard Recognition," and it painted a picture of cooking as an act of love rather than ego, of tradition as a source of strength rather than limitation. I framed the magazine cover and hung it in my kitchen, right next to my grandmother's recipe cards and her cast iron pan, which had its own place of honor on the wall. Not because I needed the validation, but because I wanted to remember that moment of choice, when I could have backed down or fought back, when I decided that my grandmother's legacy was worth defending, that my own voice was worth raising. 6 months later, I opened my own catering business specializing in heritage recipes and comfort food. Not fancy, not pretentious, just honest food, cooked with care and served with pride. My first client was Margaret from the cooking class, who hired me to cater her divorce party. My second was David, who wanted me to teach him to make his grandmother's pierogi for a family reunion. Within a year, I was booked solid, featured in local food magazines, invited to judge amateur cooking competitions. I never saw Chef Beaumont again, but I heard through the restaurant industry grapevine that his behavior in classes had become more subdued, more respectful. Whether that was because of our confrontation, or because the culture was finally shifting away from tolerating abuse disguised as instruction, I didn't know. I didn't really care. I was too busy building something positive to spend energy on his negativity. But sometimes, late at night when I was prepping for the next day's events, I'd think about that moment in the kitchen when he tried to break me down, when he thought he could dismiss me as easily as he probably dismissed hundreds of other students over the years. I'd think about how close I'd come to accepting his assessment, to packing up my grandmother's pan and slinking out of his kitchen with my tail between my legs. And I'd remember the lesson that evening had really taught me, that the most dangerous thing you can do to someone who's trying to diminish you is to refuse to be diminished. To stand your ground, trust your instincts, and let your work speak for itself. Because in the end, talent and authenticity and love will always outlast arrogance and cruelty and borrowed authority. The cast iron pan still sits in my kitchen, seasoned now with even more meals, more memories, more moments of connection and nourishment. Sometimes I use it for coq au vin, sometimes for Sunday gravy, sometimes just for scrambled eggs on a quiet morning when I want to feel connected to something larger than myself. But every time I cook with it, I remember that night at Le Bernardin, when a marketing coordinator from Queens proved that the most important ingredient in any dish isn't technique or expensive equipment or professional training. It's courage. The courage to believe in yourself, to honor your heritage, to stand up for what matters, and to never let anyone convince you that your voice doesn't belong in the conversation. That's the recipe I'm proudest of, the one I'll never share in any magazine or teach in any class, because it's something everyone has to learn for themselves. But I can tell you this, once you find it, once you taste that particular flavor of self-respect and quiet confidence, everything else you cook will be better for it. And that, more than any award or recognition or professional success, is what makes the whole journey worthwhile.